Hi, welcome to the Cows Podcast. I'm your host, Hunter Burney. A catalyst is defined as a person or thing that precipitates an event. A catalyst is something that it participates in a reaction but does not get consumed in the reaction. There's a heart behind this podcast for, people with aspirations. There's a heart behind this podcast for motivated people that want to make a difference, that have a bias for action, that really truly want to be a catalyst in the environment around them, both professionally and personally, in their homes, in their workplace, and beyond. So welcome to this podcast. I really hope you're enjoying the series that we're in. Welcome to this episode, and let's dive right in. Okay, so we are back with this third segment with Coach Jimmy Hayes Nelson. I hope you've caught the first couple episodes. We've talked about Jimmy's story to some depth for sure. If you haven't heard the first grade story, then you're definitely missing out. But just as we've unpacked this idea of against all odds and just overcoming big obstacles, that's really the heart behind this series and this message and this interview is what's hidden inside of you. What do you have the capability to overcome that maybe you don't have the confidence or resources or means or something like that to do? So just as we shift into this third segment, Jimmy, I would love to hear what you're excited about looking forward, and then, we'll get into a couple of things.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to, I guess what has me excited is as we've moved to this culture where we were all separated for a year, but we found ways to connect, right? We've never had more ways to communicate and connect than ever in the history of ever. However, so many people still don't do it well or know how to do it or take advantage of it. And so what I really am excited about is continuing to just encourage and empower people to use these formats to start sharing stories, to get a little vulnerable. And there is a vulnerability piece about this. I mean, we really haven't touched on this a whole lot, but if you think about it, when I talk about, we were talking about the story about Fat Jimmy on the stage or me having to move back home 100 pounds overweight. Like, these pieces aren't the highlight reels. I'm not telling you about my biggest income month. I'm not telling you about how many clients I have. I'm sharing with you vulnerable moments because it's in the vulnerability that people connect with us. That's what that know, like, and trust. Like, man, this guy is showing me his wounds a little bit. And therefore, like, he's not just running. I mean, I think we've heard those people that pop on something and they just want to tell you, let me tell you all the reasons. This is how great I am. Here's my resume bullet points. And I don't know about you, but I immediately pull a wall up a little bit, even if they've done something great, because I'm just like, man, you're really trying hard to impress me. I just want to know who you are. I was like, yeah. Obviously we'll get to that point. And so what I think now is, like, there's so many opportunities, whether it's podcasts, whether it's YouTube videos, or it's Zoom. I literally just I ended my year in the end of December doing a virtual event. Like, I was on a stage in a 360 degree stage, 15-foot walls. I think they said 60 million pixels. It was basically a giant interactive Zoom room.
Wow.
And it was a 3-day event for 40,000 people in 100 countries.
Yeah.
And it's because I knew how to tell a story in that moment. And I knew how to tell a story actually comfortably on a camera. Before all this came up, we would be talking about storytelling, and only people that were public speakers or in sales would think that's for me.
Yep.
Even though that wasn't the case either. And I think now everybody can empower themselves with their own story, whether it's just doing a FaceTime or you and I talking right here, up to a virtual stage where I could see Zoom people all around me talking to people from all over the world. It's that thing of, once you learn this skill of telling your story, mm-hmm. you can have a huge impact on the world, and whatever that means for you. That means building a big business. Does that mean creating a cause or a fundraising situation? I don't know what that is for you. Whether it's creating change in society, in a mindset, it goes back to learning how to tell a story. And so I'm just excited now that I think people are more open with where we've been over the past few months, mm-hmm. to realize the power of being able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most people's jobs have been affected. Arguably there's some that maybe really didn't and just couldn't out of necessity for some reason. But I think for the average professional listening to this, most people have had more time at home, whether that's, just because of the forced shutdowns or being transitioned to remote work and things like that. And naturally, I've heard a lot of stories about people just reflecting on everything from, is this house the right house, right? You just spend more time, and I think some of the distractions of life were forced to go away,
Yeah.
and more reflection, things like that. So I think, yeah, I think it's a great time for a lot of people to continue to evaluate. Just because we're in a new year doesn't mean that opportunity is something that you lost last year. It's still a great time to figure out, how do I, what are my goals, right? What are my goals 24 months from now, 60 months from now, and so on. And how do I, use thought-provoking conversations like this and just a change in platform, or how do I get uncomfortable and grow and think about, how I can add value back to the market or a certain community or something like that. I think it's
Yeah. And
awesome.
the other piece of this, Hunter, is not getting caught in just being a consumer. And what I mean by that is we are so blessed and cursed at the same time at the availability of knowledge, right? They can sit here and binge your entire podcast. We can jump on YouTube and there's all the knowledge of the world at our fingertips, right?
Mm-hmm.
Free knowledge, literally. If you could figure anything, some 12-year-old could teach you and I everything on YouTube at any time.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, and I feel like I was a little blessed because when I started my business in the business world in 2007 was kind of early social media days,
Mm-hmm.
is I could read books and stuff, but I didn't get caught up in just learn knowledge. I had a mentor that was like, it has to be a balance of learn knowledge and applied knowledge. So if somebody listens to this and takes some of these tips that you and I have shared or storytelling, goes, gosh, that's a great idea. Now I know that, but never goes and practice it, never goes and puts it into action, it's futile. Like knowledge with no action, there's just no point to it. And the other piece of that is you have to be willing to be bad at something. And I remind people like, oh, Jimmy, you're very well spoken. You're good on camera. I remember my very first audition in college, still 100 pounds overweight, was supposed to have a monologue memorized. And I walked on the stage with the script in hand that I didn't know. And I literally would get this physical twitch where I couldn't control. I felt stupid. Like I'm looking at my hands. I'm like, don't shake, don't shake.
Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't stop. And it was like, if I can go from that dude to this dude, you can tell your story as well, but you have to be willing to go get reps. None of this, every person that you've ever seen that's good at something is because they were willing to be bad at something first. They were willing to be embarrassed by it. They were willing to practice when there was no audience. They're willing to like click the live button, practice the story, and not care if there's 1 or 0 people that show up. It's not about that at the first.
Mm-hmm.
It's about honing the craft. It's about practicing. It's about the reps. And if I had one thing where I just find people push back a little bit, is it's in that piece.
Mm-hmm.
When I get done with my workshops, I always say the person that's going to win is the person that goes and messes this up the first.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be perfect the first time. But you can't have a second time unless you have a first time. And nobody is good at anything the first time. I'm sure this podcast has evolved from the first time you hooked up that microphone to who you are now. And you're going to continue. 6 months from now, you're going to be looking back at this episode and go, oh, I remember when we used to do it that way. This is where we are now. And somewhere along the way, I don't know if it's society, I don't know if it's Instagram filters, I don't know what it is, but we lost the ability to be vulnerable and just tell your audience, new at this, I don't know what I'm doing, but I have a vision for where I want this to go. And you know what? If you, instead of just trying to be perfect, if you let your audience know we're on the journey, they're going to love you more because they get to be a part of the building process. There are people that would much rather be a part of building something, supporting somebody that's trying to up and come on something than the person that's already established. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine today about that, about, hey, I actually want to help the person that I know is trying to build the audience and the person that's established that doesn't need me,
Yeah.
And so we should lean into that.
Yeah. No, specifically in my case, it makes me think of, I think it's, oh man, it's not Stitcher. anyway, there's a startup podcast. It's called Startup.
Uh-huh.
And I listened to that in just almost from beginning to end. There were a ton of episodes, but prior to really committing to launching this, but one of the things that fascinated me is it was the first podcast that I'd ever run across where he and his wife were part of starting this business, and he injected recordings into the podcast episodes where he had just pulled out his phone where he and his wife were having this, is this the right decision? Are we going to make it? Are we going to make payroll? Just some of these raw conversations that were part of his process, part of their process in getting this business off the ground. And that inspired me. That was just, it's very engaging. It's great to hear, like you're saying, being vulnerable and connecting with, connecting with your target audience through that, through the story and through just being able to own the journey, right? And not have to go from zero experience to expert without, behind closed doors.
I remember that podcast. And you know what's funny about that, Hunter? I remember I listened to the whole thing like on a road trip when it first came out. And I stopped listening once they launched the podcast because I wasn't interested anymore. I was all about them trying to build it. It's the same thing. I don't know if you watched, I guess this came out during last year as well, but when they released the Last Dance series on ESPN about the 90s Bulls.
Yeah.
So I grew up, that was like my wheelhouse growing up, but I had forgotten who Michael Jordan was before he was Michael Jordan, like the first 7 years when he was the guy that couldn't win it, before the shoes were the thing. Like we all had this vision of Mike, and Mike's always been awesome. Yeah. Well, yes, he's always been awesome, but I went back and I was like, gosh, I love going back and watching that. I'm about to do I'm working on an Instagram carousel reel about the movies that I tend to gravitate towards. Somebody asked the other day, like, what's your favorite movie? I'm like, it changes all the time, but there's definitely a theme, and it's movies like The Social Network, like the Facebook movie, right? It's movies like The Founder, the Ray Kroc McDonald's one. It's even Wolf of Wall Street or 8 Mile. It's these things where like these underdogs are having to make their way up, and so like once they're on top, it's not as interesting anymore. And I'm always reminded, people want to root for the person that's hustling and up and coming. And so, again, as we kind of put a bow on this thing about that, is cool. You're not an expert on this thing yet, or you're an expert and you have zero following. You don't know where to start. Lean into that and make that part of the messaging. Yo, this is what happened in 2020. I lost my job. I've always been really into travel, or I've always really been into sports, or, I've had this, I know a thing or two about whiskey. I got a buddy of mine that does that. He's like, I'm just going to start talking about this. I don't know if it's a business, but I'm passionate about it. I'm going to start. I appreciate your support. And just being that like transparent with your audience. Yeah. They're going to love that. The right people are going to love that. People that want to follow somebody established, great. You don't need everybody also, Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of parallels just thinking about this from a little bit further away. I think there's a lot of parallels to, when I think about middle manager type positions, right? In your middle organization, you're responsible for taking a strategy and implementing it. I see a lot of parallels with, you have to be transparent. You can't act like you have all the answers. You're not necessarily going to, and if you do, was the objective even worth it? Like if you got it all figured out in the beginning, why is the team working on it, right? And there wasn't a problem to solve to begin with. So I think there's a lot of parallels you can draw with that. I appreciate you kind of laying that out.
Of course.
So we've done you've certainly done a great job of threading in some very specific pieces of advice through the lens of your coaching, but also just in general. But can you just take a moment to maybe summarize some of it, or just maybe 2 or 3 bullet points as you think back specifically to maybe 15 years ago or 20 years ago? And I'm not sure how far back you want to reflect on, or maybe more specifically early to mid-career professionals.
Yeah. I think if I look back at, when you start looking back and you're like, okay, how did I get to where I am? Because it's really easy to kind of lose track of all the steps. But when I look back, or somebody's like, "Hey, Jimmy, how did you get here? What's your, is there some secret sauce?" And there isn't one thing. I had a guy one time, he's like, "Hey, what was the one thing you did that made things take off?" And it was like, it wasn't. It was showing up every day. And that all leaned to, for whatever reason, growing up, I had always been the kid that quit everything. I quit Taekwondo. I quit playing saxophone. Anytime it just wasn't fun anymore, I quit things. And I don't know where it switched. And it might have been that moment in the mirror where I'm like, I don't want to be that guy anymore. And I think I tell people, we have to be willing to rewrite who we are in our stories sometimes as we tell our stories. And for me, when I dipped my toe into entrepreneurship for the first time, it wasn't, let me try this. I'm going to try it for 30 days and see if it works. I was like, I'm in this for the long haul, and I'm going to learn something every day. I'm going to show up every day in some way, shape, or fashion. And I never worried about, is this worth it? Am I wasting time doing this? Am I wasting money investing in that coaching program, that workshop, that thing, or what? Even just the money it took to start a business. Am I wasting money? I had to get out of that mindset that I was like, I'm going somewhere and I'm going to play the long game, whether that be in my business, with relationships, with prospects. It was never, how do I make the quickest buck? Where's the shortcut? And if I could share anything with people, it's learn to hone that story, start telling it, start showing up, and fall in love with the process. And I think if I go back into my acting career, I had a mentor that had me fall in love with rehearsal more than the performance. And dude, nobody loves some applause more than I do. There are people that like to be told they're pretty and told good job. And I'm definitely one of those words of affirmation guys, but somewhere along the way, both in my fitness journey and in my professional life, I learned to fall in love with the grind and the process of figuring things out. That it became this little game for me. And then when the audience shows up, you're already ready. When opportunity knocks, I told you about that event last month, 40,000 people. I had 4 days notice for that event.
Wow.
And one of my mantras in life is, I don't get ready, I stay ready.
Yeah, I love that.
Because I show up when there's nobody watching. So when their opportunity does knock, I'm done. I'm ready. It's cool. I want to build that Instagram following. Cool. Are you showing up and posting and serving your audience before the brand sponsorship shows up, before somebody comes and gives you the opportunity? Are you showing up and doing the podcast, regardless of how many likes it gets, or, are you, there's always going to be a new thing. Are you willing to just continue to grind and show up and really have into your heart, I'm telling this story. I'm going to get up and I'm going to tell this story again about first grade Jimmy, or the embarrassing part about, being 100 pounds overweight and moving in with my parents. Cause I'm like, gosh, I'm going to tell it again today because somebody hasn't heard this yet. And somebody's like, somebody thinks that they're the only one, but somebody heard this story today and they're like, whoa, this dude gets me. Or, oh, if he can, I can. And that's why we got to show up every day. Cause I just feel, Hunter, I really truly believe that every day we show up and don't share a vulnerable piece of our story, it's selfish. It's not about us anymore. I show up and I made a 13-year career to sharing my story and stories of others in the hopes to get that person sparked. You listen to that podcast, the startup podcast, and that's why you and I are kind of sitting here having this conversation, because somebody else shared a vulnerable story about struggling to start a podcast. There's power in that. And so I just want people to wrap their heads around, you don't know the power of your story, and you don't know it until you start. You got to practice. You got to be willing to be bad. It's going to be bad first. Mine continues to evolve. I go back and listen to interviews and I'm like, oh, I could have, I'm harder on myself, and I work on this stuff harder now than I did when I first got started. So do it, because there's somebody out there that needs you to tell your story.
Man, that's amazing. I appreciate you sharing that. So just a couple random questions and then we'll close this out. So you're in the Dallas area. I've done a decent amount of time, just being a tourist in that area. Do you guys have like a favorite restaurant? Are you Pappas fans, or is that too commercial? Or are you?
No, I actually live around the corner from Bob's Steak and Chop House. Which there are Bob's Steak and there is one in Nashville that I've eaten at that are in a lot of. I think they're in Omni hotels now. But the original Bob's Steak and Chop House I can walk to from my house, just right outside of Highland Park here in Dallas. So for me, it's that. And there's a litany of barbecue places here. So that's a whole other episode if we just talk about barbecue places that I would sit and eat in Dallas. But if I had to pick one, it's probably Bob's.
So you talk about barbecue in Texas, and there are, don't get me wrong, there are some barbecue places that do pork and it's not an issue. But I walked in when we moved to Longview. I walked into the name. I'm drawing a blank on the name. I walked into the barbecue place there, and I told them I wanted a pound of pulled pork, and they just kind of looked at me like, we don't do pork here. This is
Yeah,
beef only. I was
yeah,
like,
it's cow. It's cow. It's funny. I told you I have relatives in Kentucky, and every time I go there, yeah, it's like my grandmother went to the same place to get pulled pork, and the sauce is different, and I love both. It's
yeah,
just it's a different animal. It's really interesting as you go around the country. Barbecue varies very much depending on what region you're in.
yeah, that's funny. And the other question I had was just kind of more focused on the fitness side of things. Uh, 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 I like to think of myself as I really enjoy fitness and have a lot of aspirations around just being healthy in that manner. What's your favorite part about your fitness journey, or maybe what you're doing now?
Man, that's a great question. So my background was with Beachbody, and that's where I started my career in 13 years of losing 100 pounds with programs. Getting the honor of being a cast member in the Insanity DVDs with Shaun T, and he's a dear friend of mine, and Tony Horton's a buddy of mine, and was in the PIO DVDs with Shalene. And I
That's
think
cool.
for me, like I said, I just turned 43. I turned 43 and hit a new deadlift max and an overhead squat max this past year. So the past 4 years, in addition to Beachbody, I have a CrossFit coach that I see 3 times a week here in Dallas, and it's always the next thing. I like to think of myself as a fitness Swiss Army knife. So if you
Yeah,
stick me in a spin class or a yoga class, or ask me to do Insanity, or let's go clean and jerk, I want to do a little bit of everything, and it turned into what's the next skill.
yeah,
It's somewhere along the way it went from, and I'm as vain as anybody else that wants to look good, and I want my suits to fit right, and I want to be able to be comfortable at the pool party or whatever that is. But it became this fitness tool belt, and like literally when I started working with my trainer that I work with now, I watched one of those like CrossFit documentaries, and I'm like, okay, I've done Insanity, I can do P90X, I've done spin things, I ran a half marathon. That's about as long as I think I run. I don't think I have marathon aspirations. So running's probably my least favorite, but I told myself I could do that. But I told him, I was like, look, I'm not trying to come in here and go to the CrossFit games. I was like, if we just have a PVC pipe, I called it Project No Ego. I was
yeah,
like, I just want to learn more about Olympic lifts, because I didn't grow up, I wasn't fit growing up. So I didn't have like so many of my buddies are like, oh, we did a lot of that playing football growing up. I didn't do that.
hmm,
And so just being able to accomplish some really cool fitness milestones on this side of 40 and
hmm,
feel more awesome at 43 than I did at 23. That's
hmm,
what I love about this whole fitness journey. I referenced Tony Horton, the guy that created P90X.
yeah,
He's in his 60s, his early mid 60s, and I'm watching him still do pull-ups. He
yeah.
talks about, one of his phrases is that aging is for idiots. And he's been a great example of how we can continue to get better. And so, hopefully my best years are still ahead of me, and it's this fun journey of how can I continue to raise the bar. And I think that's just become a mantra in all areas of my life.
Yeah, that's fascinating. No, I think, yeah, there's a lot. And again, I think you referenced this earlier. This could be probably its own episode,
It
but
could be its
I
own
think
episode.
I think
Absolutely.
there's a lot to draw from. I'm more on the endurance side, training for my first full Ironman
Awesome,
as
man.
as we record this. This will probably release probably around the time that I'll be doing it, but I do have a lot of interest in shifting from that endurance and going more toward kind of a hybrid, like a Spartan or something like that involves more strength and just a little bit of a twist on endurance type stuff. But principally just as a human being, I think there's a ton to draw from that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
and it bleeds over. I think fitness is such a great analogy for so many things in life. And again, going back to showing up when nobody's there, when there is no accountability, running in the dark, doing like all these things is cool. When the lights come on, you're going to be found out what you were doing when the lights weren't there and there was nobody there. And so there's so many parallels with business and fitness. Yeah, we do another episode. We can you and I could talk for hours on that alone, man.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Hey,
Awesome.
real quick, I know I've already mentioned the coachjimmy.com Is there another place that you would point listeners to connect with you? And I know you're on various social media, but is there
So I'm the Coach Jimmy on any social media. But the person listening to this is like, Jimmy, I want help with my story. You talked about the memory jogger and just some tips. If they go to storywellcrafted.com, I literally have free resources there for people to start putting their story together and kind of identifying what it is. So that's storywellcrafted.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate your time. It's been great to get to know you better, and excited to see where things go for you.
Awesome. Let's keep in touch, Hunter, but I appreciate the time.
Thank you for being a part of this journey. Definitely subscribe, check out Be a Catalyst on Instagram and on Twitter. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube channel where you'll find videos in addition to the Catalyst podcast recordings that give a little bit more context around my heart for training, my heart for seeing early to middle managers and first-time leaders really thrive and be a catalyst in the organization that they're in the project that they are after, everything that goes along with that. So thank you for being a part of this. Tune in for the next episode, and remember, be you, be confident, be a catalyst.